Well, former UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson is launching a new memoir, Unleashed. And from the released excerpts, it sounds like he is unleashing on everyone. The reviews are scathing already. The Times says Johnson is a gossipy bitch. Joining me now from London is Spiked online editor Tom Slater. Tom, good to see you. Thanks for joining us. Look, my favourite part so far was his claim that he was assassinated by Rishi Sunak, like when Brutus killed Caesar, when, of course, Mr Sunak attempted to oust him by resigning from his cabinet back in 2022. He writes, "As I read his resignation letter, with its heavy phrasing, I murmured, at least inwardly, the dying words of Julius Caesar, Kai sun tek non, you too, child. If Caesar was stabbed 23 times by his assassins, I ended up with 62 as a total of 60 ministers, followed Sarge and Rishi out the door." Tom, I've got to say, it all sounds very dramatic.
Oh, and it was. And, Boris Johnson is nothing if not dramatic, loves a classical metaphor. And, it's fair to say that Rishi Sunak and many other people in his party certainly plunged the knife in when they all resigned en masse to oust Boris Johnson. And they've been living with the consequences of that ever since. I mean, Rishi Sunak in the last election steered the Conservative Party to its worst ever electoral defeat. Boris Johnson has his fair share of the blame for bringing that about, but at the same time, the way in which they got rid of the guy who actually had a democratic mandate, I think left the writing on the wall for them, to be honest, in terms of everything that's happened since.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really fair point. He's also claimed in this memoir that Queen Elizabeth II was battling bone cancer before her death. Tom, the royal family is notoriously private. How would they feel about this being revealed to the world?
Well, in terms of some sources around the palace, there seems some displeasure at this being put in the book. That being said, it has already been mentioned in a couple of other books which have been published recently. One, a biography of Princess Kate, another one, a book about the Queen herself by a famous Tory MP, had also made reference to this particular fact. But as you say, it's one of those things where, because the Queen had kept it so private during the final months of her life, even up until the point of her being at the Jubilee, suffering with the effects of bone cancer, but not letting on to anyone, just discussing it too openly is something which has clearly kind of put people's nose out of joint effectively. It's not that this wasn't necessarily out there in the public domain, but I guess drawing more attention to it as a big release like this has understandably, I suppose, caused some consternation in the palace.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, look, the UK is about to stop producing any electricity from burning coal, ending its 142-year reliance on fossil fuel. But at the same time, new UK government figures show that the UK has the highest power prices in the developed world. So, Tom, prices are high in the UK, but how will the country go with no coal now?
Absolutely. I think those two facts are not unrelated. We're going to become the first country to completely abandon coal as a source of energy, closing our last remaining coal-fired power plant. We're also in the midst of closing our last steelworks. We're in the midst of closing down our largest oil refinery in the north in Scotland. And I think it's a reminder that this is a tremendous act, really, of sort of self-harm. This is the nation that gave the world the Industrial Revolution, and yet we're running headlong into this net zero fantasy, which seems to think that rather than going for those sources of plentiful, reliable energy that we got from fossil fuels, we now want unreliable and increasingly kind of scarce forms of energy production in the form of renewables. And I think it's a great shame. Of course, if we could gain all of the benefits from the supposedly green technologies that we did from previous forms of fossil fuels, who would be against it? But as we all know, pursuing the policies that we've been pursuing has got us to this point where British businesses are paying more money for their energy than any other country in the developed world. We know those two things are related.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's happening here in Australia. It's a pipe fantasy to go full renewables by a certain date, and it's just not shaping up that that's ever going to happen. Now, look, let's talk about the freebie scandal engulfing Keir Starmer. Gifts to the Prime Minister skyrocketed from $900 to over £100,000, which is about 192,000 Australian dollars, as he was lavished with hospitality ahead of his election victory. Tom, what's going on here? What's been the fallout?
It's really dogged this government. which looks as scandal-ridden and as exposed as if it had been in power for 4 or 5 years by this particular point. As you said, there's been all these scandals about freebies, everything from Taylor Swift tickets to Keir Starmer being bought thousands and thousands of pounds worth of clothes and glasses by a Labour Lord Ali, who has been behind many of these particular scandals. Keir Starmer, since 2019, has been in receipt of more presents, donations, you name it, than any other MP in Parliament, and it's not even close. He's got more than double the person in second place, and that person also happens to be a Labour frontbencher. So that whiff of sleaze, I should say, is very much around this government. And I think these things wouldn't have dogged them to nearly the degree that they have if it wasn't for the fact that Keir Starmer in recent years has really acted as a kind of pearl-clutching politician. Anything the Tories did, it was the greatest scandal of all time. Anything that happened, it was proof of Tory corruption and sleaze. And now it's come back to bite them in a terrible way. But I think anyone could have seen that coming.
Yeah, very clear. But that's an extraordinary amount of money to be spending. Tom Slater, good to have you on. Thank you so much for joining us on the show.